Hi, my name's Sam. I'm a community organiser based in Hastings, and I'm about to give a short presentation. Shouldn't hopefully keep you too long. The presentation is something that I put together to hand back to the voluntary and community sector coronavirus response hub. The hub has been in operation since the early stages of the first lockdown, when a group of people came together to see how the voluntary and community sector could best support the community through lockdown initially and then through the ongoing pandemic. We have coordinated an awful lot of volunteer resource. We've also coordinated with statutory agencies to try and manage fluctuations in demand for various services, and generally been trying to figure out any ways that we can rally our resources to best effect for the general community. So we've been operating, as I say, since early stages of the first lockdown. Now here we are in the second lockdown, and we've had lots of discussions about what we expect to be the likely economic and social impacts of both lockdowns and the pandemic itself. Lots of people out of work, and various other challenges that we expect might arise. And with all of that in mind, we were trying to figure out how best to plan a recovery. Once things do start to get closer to being back to normal, how do we then start to piece together a recovery that can make sure that those who are most vulnerable through all of this and who may have been worst affected are best looked after. So with that in mind, I have a background in citizen journalism. I've got a keen interest in public data. I don't have any formal training in data analysis, but I have been giving myself some ad hoc training. I've taken the opportunity this year to try and learn as much as possible. And as a result, I put myself forward to try and gather as much public data, as much data generally as I could get my hands on to try and inform us and give us the best, most reliable picture of the situation as it exists on the ground around the town. So I'm about to give a presentation which I've given to the hub already, and this will go on to form a report which I'm hoping to report back on in 2 weeks' time. The report will be a little bit more formalised, and we'll hopefully have slightly more up-to-date data. Everything that I'll be going over today, I'm going to try and give you a feel for how relevant and how recent the data is. Some of it's quite bang up to date, but other bits I do need to update, and I'm still waiting on more data to come through from some of the partner organisations that I've been working with. But this hopefully gives a reasonably good picture around some of the key concerns that we've got currently. So this work it's designed to inform future interventions and shouldn't be considered a standalone piece of work. It's imperfect. It should just fit in with all the other things that we're doing and all the other reports that we might be finding. I expected when I set out to do this work that we'd find a number of blind spots, places where data capture isn't quite so robust, and areas that could be improved going forward. And I think I have found a number of those. So I'm hoping that the full report itself can make some recommendations about that. I also started out knowing that actually a lot of voluntary and community sector organisations and public and statutory sector organisations rely on public data already, but that actually most public data that you can get your hands on easily is normally quite significantly out of date, to the tune of 3, 6 or 12 months quite often. And so in a situation like the pandemic where things are evolving very rapidly, it's not so reliable. So I tried to figure out, of the public data that we might normally rely on, is there ways or are there ways to get more up-to-date versions of that data? So starting out on this work, it was quite a broad remit. Let's gather data to inform our response. So I tried to narrow it down to some sort of key domains, particular things that we think might be impacting people across the town. And the 4 domains that I eventually settled on were around mental health or mental illness, jobs and income, food security, and housing. I think if we can get a good picture of those, then we'll be able to help those who are being worst impacted. By no means should this be considered to be an exhaustive list of all the things that might be going on in the community, but I think in terms of sort of an emergency response to try and support people most vulnerable, then these are the key areas that we need to be looking at. Where existing local data doesn't tell a clear enough story, I've attempted to match it with national data and research, and combine those different data sets, and I'll explain this as I go through. So this is a little mind map. It might not be that visible. Basically, it was for my reference, just so that I knew that I had enough organisations involved, so I could get enough data effectively. Any boxes that are hatched in red there is sources where I'm still trying to get hold of the data. So hopefully in the full report, which, as I say, I'm hoping to get published hoping to release in about 2 weeks' time, I'll have the fuller data. So one of the first domains that I wanted to try and investigate was mental illness. I still don't have the data set that I eventually settled on trying to get hold of, so I'm still waiting on that from local public health representatives, but they assure me it's on the way. So I tried to measure a few metrics around this. It's been kind of difficult to get a really decent picture. So I looked at ways that Public Health England normally plan interventions around mental illness in the area to try and get a gauge on where we sit as a town anyway. And the graph at the bottom here shows something from the Public Health England Mental Health Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, which uses a number of methodologies to try and estimate mental health prevalence or mental illness prevalence within a given area. So they've got a couple of approaches. One of their approaches is to look at ESA, Employment Support Allowance claims. So that's claims for people who are unable to work because of an illness or disability. So they would look at ESA claims in an area where mental health or behavioural disorders were listed as primary diagnosis. Now I think there's a drawback to that because obviously it's only recording people who are out of work because of their mental illness. Doesn't record necessarily people who aren't in that situation. And I think given the nature of the situation we're in, a lot of people, that would miss a lot of people basically. So that's not really an effective metric to measure. I then looked at the other metrics that they use. So they rely on something called the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, and then they weight that against our local demography. But again, that's not really that robust. The Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey is not necessarily effective in this circumstances because actually they haven't carried out that survey since coronavirus kicked in. So yeah, the results from that wouldn't be great, but it does give us, I mean, these two things do give us an idea of where we stood before the pandemic, and comparing us to the national the regional and national averages, you can see that Hastings tends to have a higher prevalence against those two metrics than normal. So we tend to have more mental illness than the regional or national averages. So we can assume that going forward we'll have a higher response. So with all of that in mind, I decided probably the best way to try and figure out the situation as it exists on the ground was to go to the local NHS mental health provider, Health in Mind, and ask about referrals. Again, that's not as cut and dried as I hoped. I'm still waiting on the information from them, but anecdotally they've told me a little bit, and that is that referrals to their services matched the national trend. So in the early stages of lockdown, there was a national trend that mental health referrals actually dropped massively. I think nationally it was about 60% they dropped off by, but I think locally it may have been more than that. And there's lots of reasons why that might be. GP surgeries closing was one of the reasons because a lot of their referrals tend to come from GP surgeries. Other possible reasons might be that people weren't interacted with statutory services the way they previously would. And also there is a suspicion that people were trying to lessen the burden on the NHS and so weren't referring themselves for things that they might consider to be minor problems. So the long and the short of it is that actually Health in Mind are currently, I believe they're back up to full staffing capacity, but actually in terms of referrals in, they're at a lower rate of referrals into services than they were at this same time last year, I believe. As I say, I'm still waiting on the data to back that up. So it sounds like we are expecting that there will be a higher rate of mental ill health, and that's what a lot of leading national charities are suggesting, that actually there are already signs of quite an impending sort of mental health crisis. So we're expecting that actually locally there is increased prevalence of mental illness, but actually fewer people than even previous to the pandemic accessing services. So potentially quite alarming. There is this chart here is taken from a report which has been written by the Centre for Mental Health, who are a national charity who have been doing a bit of forecasting. They've been looking at a number of research studies to try and estimate and forecast what the likely increase in demand on mental health services might be. And they are predicting roughly a 10% increase in demand on mental health services nationally. So we'll see how that will play out locally. And as I say, in the full report, hopefully I'll have slightly more up-to-date data from Health in Mind on their referrals in, and hopefully I'll have had a chance to speak to a few of the public health representatives there to get a little bit more insight, hopefully, on this. So the next domain I want to talk about is jobs and income. So obviously the furlough scheme kicked in quite early. It was one of the government's first responses, and was reasonably robust for PAYE employees. For self-employed people, it was not quite so catch-all, and there were a good sort of 2 million people who didn't really qualify for any services, as far as I'm aware, across the country. But with that, even though we had the furlough, which was supposed to rescue an awful lot of jobs, actually, there was, even in the early stages, even when that was announced, it was sort of conceded that actually a lot of jobs may not come back from furlough. So that was always there. So this chart in front of us is the COVID-19 Economic Vulnerability Index, which is something that was put together by the Oxford Consultants for Social Inclusion. And it is based on research from the Office for National Statistics and a few other government departments who look at the prevalence of jobs in particular industries in a certain area, and then they weight that against the amount of jobs in those industries which were furloughed, and then they do some further calculations to figure out how many of those jobs that were furloughed may not come back once furlough ends. Hope that makes sense. So that gives a rough potential for Hastings, as we can see here on the chart. It gives a rough potential overall job losses of around 9,000 based on that sort of desk-based research. Now this index was actually published in May, so it was really early on. Didn't take long for this to come out, and so it was very much just a prediction. And obviously a lot of things have changed since then. We've had an extension of the furlough scheme, although actually we also had a predicted end of the furlough scheme, but then actually an extension quite late in the day, which may have led to further job losses. But yeah, the next slide should give us a bit more of a picture of what's actually happening. So this next slide is universal credit and JSA claimants across the town. So I pulled this from NOMIS, which is the Labour Market Office, I believe it is, from their website. And this gives us a picture. So this whole chart shows historic universal credit and JSA claimants going back to 2013, when Hastings was one of the first towns to take on universal credit. You can see the chart as it plays out. So actually on the far right hand side, you can see around March, April this year, claimants shot through the roof, jumped quite significantly, and haven't really tailed off since. And actually, if you can compare that to all the way back through to 2013, it does look like actually we're seeing unprecedented levels of universal credit claims and JSA claims. I don't know if we were to go back further than 2013 to look at JSA claims. I don't know if there's been a time where Hastings was in quite such a stark situation. But you can see that actually since the jump in March and April, there was a slight drop off in sort of June, but actually since then we've kind of plateaued, and even in October there's not been a great deal of drop off there. Obviously the data, as I'm talking to you, it's the 19th of November, so we're still waiting on November's data. I think that'll be an interesting one, with the furlough scheme originally having been scheduled to end in October. But then extended late in the day. I don't know what that'll mean. I'm expecting that there'll be a further jump in unemployment in November, but I may be wrong. Here we are, just a comparison to same time period in 2019 and then same time period in 2020. So in the bottom left there is a number of of claimants in the area. So that's pretty much straight doubled the amount. And on the right hand side, I've done a comparison. So effectively, this is by no means perfect, but this is a rough calculation of the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is calculated by finding the amount of people who are currently out of work and dividing it by the amount of people in an area who are economically active, so who could be working. Doesn't look at whether or not they are working, but so if you do that calculation, that's how you can calculate the unemployment rate. So the government currently is saying the national unemployment rate is 4.5%. As I've done the sums, it's come to 4%, but I know I'm aware that my sums aren't perfect because I'm missing a few legacy benefits and various other things. But the two figures I've got there in the bottom right were both calculated using exactly the same methodology. Yeah, we're roughly more than double the national unemployment rate in Hastings currently. Sorry, just going back to the unemployment there, just obviously the furlough scheme has been extended till March. So worth bearing in mind that actually a lot of people who were potentially going to become unemployed or made redundant around October hopefully may have been extended. So it's difficult to say, but we'll see as the data unfolds. Understanding that about the unemployment market or the employment market in Hastings, naturally you tend to think, okay, what further challenges might arise as people's economic circumstances are changing so significantly? Is homelessness being affected? If you look at the data, it would suggest that actually currently no, homelessness is not being affected massively right now. We've seen, so the top chart there was too long to fit on one level, so I've doubled it down. That shows the age of claimants, the age of people who are registering as homeless with Hastings Borough Council, an account of those respective ages. And it shows a comparison of March to October 2019 and March to October 2020. And you'll see the grand totals are not significantly different. So they're roughly the same amount of people over that time have registered with Hastings Borough Council as homeless. And again, if you look at the main reasons for loss of settled home, there's not a massive amount of fluctuation. There are a few things there which might suggest what's going on, but nothing major. Below that are two paragraphs from Andrew Palmer, the lead officer for housing at Hastings Borough Council, with a bit of an appraisal of the situation from his perspective. He is saying that actually they are finding it harder to, people are spending longer on average in temporary accommodation currently, by 14 days ish. So there's more of a challenge to try and find temporary accommodation for people currently, to find move-on accommodation and longer-term accommodation. And he says that whilst the picture at the minute doesn't look too frightening or bad, actually they're expecting to see increased demand, and this points to the fact that actually there was a ban on evictions throughout lockdown, which has now come to an end. So actually we may well see a lot more eviction cases being processed, but at the same time also the courts were operating at much lesser capacity, or they may have closed during the first lockdown, and now that they're coming back they are operating at lower capacity, so actually it may take them a lot longer to deal with eviction cases, which in some ways it could be a good thing, because it means it will delay people's actual evictions and allow perhaps some intervention. But also, I mean, the longer these evictions are delayed, the greater potentially people's household or personal debt is increasing as well, as rent arrears or mortgage holidays and all of these other things start to pile up. So by no means an easy picture there either. Sorry, this slide is a bit sparse, but and I've thrown this presentation together in a last-minute hurry. But this slide represents the amount of food parcels, the amount of meals given out by Hastings Food Bank at King's Church up on the Ridge, who are the largest food bank in Hastings, and I believe they may be the largest food bank in the southeast. And were incredibly busy over the lockdown period, as you can see. So on the left-hand side there, I've got a chart, just a year-by-year comparison, year-by-year and month-by-month comparison of the amount of meals that they've given out. So in the middle column there, you can see 2019, quite a sizable amount of meals given out month by month, but then in 2020, an incredible amount of food given out month by month. So absolutely Herculean effort by everybody up there. And then you can see on the right hand side a breakdown of those meals being given out by ward. I include that thing by ward to actually suggest that actually there is a correlation with a lot of these data sets. The areas that are being worst affected, there's quite a bit of correlation. So next slide here is from the Citizens Advice Bureau. I've been stationed with the Citizens Advice Bureau during the course of this work, and actually the Citizens Advice Bureau, from what I can gather, is the most is the most robust data gathering organisation. They gather some really impressive data, and they do a lot to manage it and to analyse it and to make good use of it. So what you can see here is just a list of calls into the Citizens Advice Bureau between March and June, and there's a year-by-year comparison. So the top chart shows the calls that were received through the Citizens Advice Bureau between March and June 2019, and the bottom chart shows the same, but for 2020. So I was using this as a comparison to see if there's any major. So on the left-hand side, in that left-hand column, you can see the issues that the Citizens Advice Bureau deals with, and then obviously across the top is breakdowns by age group. And so you can see which age groups may have been most affected by which issues. And you can see there's not, I mean, there has been a bit of change. So in 2019, debt was the primary sort of issue that they were dealing with there. In 2020, that's not quite such a significant issue. Numbers have dropped off quite a lot from debt advice and actually shifted to benefits universal credit advice and utilities and communications advice. So we are imagining that that's people struggling to pay bills and obviously moving on to universal credit. There's a lot more analysis to be done on that data, and this has all been compiled by a super volunteer at the Citizens Advice Bureau, Janet, and I'm hoping to speak with Janet soon and to get more up-to-date advice on this, more up-to-date data and a little bit more insight from her and other colleagues at the CAB as to what's gone on. Now I've included this slide, and as I put it together, it's a bit confusing. So there's a separation between the data on the left-hand side and the map. So the map shows this shows neighbourhood mutual aid groups that sprung up in the early stages of the lockdown. I started putting together a little map which plotted them out, and then on there we also included in the locations of food banks around the town and a few other useful things as well. And on the left-hand side, we've got two columns which show the amount of calls that were responded to by Hastings Emergency Action Response Team, which is the largest sort of mutual aid group in Hastings, which sprung up in the early stages of lockdown again and provided excellent coordination between volunteers and people in need around the town. Now I include these charts to just point out that, and this I think this has been widely recognised across the board, is that actually the community response, and I think this has been widely recognised across the country as well, is that actually community response was really impressive. The spirit of people banding together and doing whatever they could to support their neighbours was mind-blowing for a lot of people and really quite heartening. And I include it here, I include this because I think actually we do need to think quite seriously about this. And if we're going into a response, if we're going into a recovery from everything that's happened during the course of this year, we are expecting that it will be quite a difficult funding landscape potentially post-Brexit, and after having taken quite an unproductive year in a lot of ways as a nation, that funding might be harder to get hold of, but actually the scale of work to be done by voluntary and community sector groups is going to be quite substantial, and statutory agencies to bring about the recovery from this. So actually I think recognising that actually we've got huge assets out in the communities, we've got good neighbours, we've got people who are willing to get involved and do things, I think will be key in any recovery. So that's why I'm including that here. So yeah, here's a little summary of everything, and this is by no means exhaustive. This is what I just sort of put together last night quite hurriedly before giving a presentation today. So once I've had a bit more time to actually sit and process all this data and figure it out a little bit better, I'm hoping to have a much better summary and some recommendations in the full report due in 2 weeks. But here we go for now. So it would appear that we are about to experience quite significant economic upheaval, unless more government intervention is forthcoming. That being said, the furlough and support schemes seem to be cushioning the blow in a lot of ways, but it could be the case that actually they're just masking quite a big problem. So even if things recover quicker, even if there is sort of a recovery from the worst ravages of the pandemic by the end of March when the furlough schemes tail off, there will still be quite a significant hit to a number of people who, for whatever reason, may be getting into rent arrears or taking on personal debt, various other things to make it through this quite trying time. But again, that being said, if the vaccine and various other measures come in and turn things around slightly before the end of March, then it could be the case that a number of industries are able to open up closer to normal in the early stages of next year, which may rescue an awful lot of jobs. So there is still a possibility that some of the sort of more daunting statistics that are turning up at the minute could be averted. I've put in there also that Brexit still remains an unknown factor. Obviously, Brexit's due to kick in on the 1st of January, and we still don't know necessarily what that's going to hold. But yeah, so I'm just putting it in there for reference, really. Again, obviously, the furlough and support schemes carrying on till March will hopefully cushion an awful lot of any blows that may happen. And lastly, there I've got the VCS has shown incredible resilience to meet the demands placed upon it. Going forward, as a recommendation, I would like to suggest that there needs to be much more. It would be helpful if there was much more fluid data sharing between the VCS and statutory organisations. If we could get regular access to public data on a much more automated basis, then actually we'd be able to much better plan response and to flex and to meet increased demand when it comes. If we could see a little bit further down the line, that would be really helpful. And I think the best way to do that would be to share public data on a more routine basis. How we go about that is another question, because actually pulling together the data for this report I found to be quite difficult, because unsurprisingly everybody is quite busy at the minute. But if we could put some thought into that, I think it would definitely pay dividends. And then finally, just a few more recommendations. I think it's the same sort of thing really. How do we routinely share data? And then at the end there, I've put this is me and my soapbox really. So my job before all of this was, and even once lockdown was eased, is face-to-face doorstep engagement. And I think as much as we can rely on the data to tell us quite a lot about what's going on in communities, I think the best way to find out how we can help people would be to get out into communities as soon as it can be done safely and legally. I think we need to be getting out there, surveying areas, as well as just going and knocking door to door and trying to find out in what ways we could bring people together to support one another, and to find out what support would be most suitable and most appropriate on the ground. So I hope this report makes sense. It's all been put together quite quickly, and then I'm hoping that in 2 weeks' time I'll be able to give a fuller report. And I'm hoping that when this report came to you, it came with some sort of contact details for me. I will try and add some in digitally in a moment before I put this anywhere, because I am inviting any sort of comments, feedback, questions, queries, anything. As I said at the beginning, I'm not by any means an academic or a data research scientist or anything like that. This is all just stuff that I've managed to pull together. And so I'm sure there are inconsistencies and problems with it, and I'm more than happy to hear those. Any ways that you think this work could be improved, because largely I just think there's definitely value in this work, and we need to use it to get the best picture we can. So if you've got any comments, any feedback, any extra data you think I should be able to look at as well, please do let me know. That'd be really useful. Yeah, so thank you for your time. Thank you.